"Can I work here?" She whispered it so quietly that Jackson almost didn't hear her over the rain hammering the garage roof. She was 20 years old, soaking wet, and had a bruise on her left arm the size of a man's hand. She wasn't crying. That was the thing that stopped him cold. A girl in that condition, showing up at a Hells Angels garage at 11 o'clock at night, and she wasn't crying. She was just standing there, waiting, like she already knew what the answer would be and had decided she could survive it either way. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The Hells Angels chapter in Redwood Falls wasn't the kind of place most people wandered into by accident. The garage sat at the far end of Millbrook Road, past the shuttered feed store and the old grain elevator that hadn't turned since the 90s. It was the kind of address you had to be looking for, and most people in town were actively trying not to look. The men who worked and gathered there were loud, territorial, and operated by a code that outsiders rarely understood and almost never respected. They liked it that way. Ambiguity was protection. On a Tuesday night in late November, with the temperature sitting just above freezing and a hard rain coming down sideways off the ridge, the garage was full. 6 bikes were being worked on. The space heater in the corner was putting out enough heat to make the air thick and warm. Someone had brought in a case of beer. The radio was playing something with a lot of guitar in it, and nobody was paying attention to the front door. So when it swung open and the cold came in, every head turned. She stood in the doorway like she didn't know if she was allowed to step over the threshold. Blonde hair plastered flat against her face. A jacket that was at least 2 sizes too big and wasn't waterproof by any stretch of the imagination. A torn backpack hanging off one shoulder. She couldn't have weighed more than 120 pounds soaking wet, and she was absolutely soaking wet. The music kept playing. Nobody moved. Then Jackson Reed, who everyone in the chapter called Stone, set down the wrench he'd been holding and walked toward her. Jackson was 50 years old, built like a man who had spent his entire life doing hard physical things, with forearms that looked like they'd been carved out of hardwood and a face that had absorbed enough weather and hard years to look permanently resolved. He'd been president of this chapter for 11 years. He'd seen people come through that door in all kinds of conditions. Desperate people, dangerous people, people who were both. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. She looked back at him without flinching, and then she said it. "Can I work here?" Her voice was quiet, but it was steady. That was the detail that lodged itself in Jackson's chest and wouldn't let go. There was no trembling in it. No performance of helplessness. She wasn't asking to be rescued. She was making a business inquiry, except she was 20 years old and standing in a puddle of rainwater, and there was a bruise on her left arm that Jackson recognized immediately for what it was. Not a fall, not a door frame, not any of the other explanations a young woman in that situation might offer. That bruise was the shape of a grip. Somebody had grabbed her hard enough to leave a mark that was still visible days later. "What's your name?" Jackson said. "Haley. Haley Morgan. Where are you coming from?" "Haley Morgan?" She hesitated for exactly 1 second. Nowhere worth going back to. Behind Jackson, someone made a noise that might have been a laugh. He didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on her face, reading it the way he'd spent 50 years, learning to read people, looking for the layers underneath what someone was saying, for the gaps between what they offered and what they were holding back. What he saw in her face was exhaustion so deep it had gone past the physical and into something else entirely. It was the kind of tired that came from surviving something for too long. And underneath that, something harder. Something that hadn't broken yet, even though it had every reason to. He stepped back from the doorway and held it open wider. "Come inside," he said. "You're letting the cold in." Derek Collins, who the chapter called Bear, was the first one to speak once she was inside. Bear was 43, with a beard that had gone mostly gray and hands that had the permanent black stains of a man who worked with engines daily. He was not a person who expressed concern easily or often, And his opening contribution to the situation was characteristically blunt. "She needs dry clothes," Bear said, not to Haley, but to the room generally, the way a man might observe that a machine needed oil. "I'm fine," Haley said immediately. Bear looked at her. "You're dripping on my floor. I can clean it up." That got people's attention, not because it was remarkable, but because of how she said it. No embarrassment, no apology for existing in the space. Just a simple statement of what she was prepared to do. Evan Hayes, who went by Bishop, was sitting on a workbench across the garage. He was 38, lean, with watchful dark eyes, and the particular stillness of someone who had spent a long time learning to assess situations before responding to them. Bishop was the most skeptical man in the chapter, by general consensus. And he was already watching Haley with the kind of focused attention that meant he was cataloging everything: her posture, her voice, the way she held the strap of her backpack with both hands, the precise location and shape of the bruise on her arm. He didn't say anything yet. He just watched. Jackson guided Haley to a chair near the space heater and told one of the younger members to find something dry she could change into. Then he crouched down in front of her, which was a particular gesture, Jackson crouching, because it meant he was deliberately putting himself at eye level with her rather than standing over her. And he said, "You hungry? I don't want to be any trouble." "I didn't ask if you wanted to be trouble. I asked if you were hungry." Something moved across her face. It was brief, barely visible, like a ripple on water before it went still again. "Yes," she said, "I'm hungry." "Okay," Jackson said, and stood back up. "Then we'll start with that." She ate 2 sandwiches and half a bag of chips without saying anything, sitting close to the heater, still wearing the dry sweatshirt someone had found for her. The garage had slowly returned to version of its normal rhythm tools being picked up, conversations resuming. The radio turned down slightly as if by collective instinct. But nobody stopped watching her. They just got better at making it look like they weren't. Bear was the one who finally broke the resumed quiet by walking over with 2 mugs of coffee and setting one in front of her without ceremony. "You're not from here," he said. It wasn't a question. "No." "Where from?" She wrapped both hands around the mug. "Farther east." Bear nodded slowly, like that was a real answer. "How'd you find us?" "Gas station. The guy working the counter told me there was a garage on Millbrook that sometimes had work." "Tommy," Bear said. To no one in particular. Tommy Briggs ran the Shell station on Route 9 and had apparently decided to become a referral service for the chapter without mentioning it to anyone. He said the guys here were rough, Haley said, and then she looked up at Bear directly, but that they were straight. He said if I needed honest work, this was the place. Bear looked at her for a moment. "What kind of work?" "Anything that needs doing." She paused. "I'm good with paperwork. Records, numbers. I notice things that are off." "A 20-year-old girl notices things that are off," Bear said. "Yes, in motorcycle garage records. In anything," she said it without arrogance, just certainty. "I've had to learn fast my whole life. You learn to see what's wrong with systems pretty quickly when being wrong about them costs you something real." Bear looked at her for another long moment. Then he picked up his coffee and walked back across the garage. And the only thing he said, mostly to himself but loud enough to carry, was, Bishop came over around midnight, after most of the others had drifted to other parts of the building or headed home. He pulled a stool up a few feet away from Haley and sat on it, and for a moment he just looked at her, and she looked back at him, and neither of them spoke. Then Bishop said, "That bruise on your arm, how old is it?" Haley glanced down at her arm, then back up at him. 5 days. He'd do it more than once. The question landed with the weight of something that already knew its own answer. Haley's jaw tightened slightly. "That's a personal question." "It is," Bishop agreed. "You're in my garage asking for a job. That makes some personal questions relevant." "Your garage?" "Our garage." He paused. "You understand what this place is, what we are." "I do. And you walked in here anyway." "I did." Bishop leaned forward slightly, elbows on knees. "Why? Of all the places you could have gone." "Because," Haley said, and her voice was still steady, still controlled, but something underneath it had shifted. Like the pressure in a room before a storm, the places that look safe aren't always safe. And sometimes the places that look dangerous are the only ones that will actually tell you the truth. Bishop was quiet for a long moment. Who told you that? He finally asked. Experience, she said. He sat back, looked at her one more time, the way a man looks at something he hasn't quite decided how to categorize. Then he said, don't steal anything. Don't lie to us. And if someone's coming after you, you tell us before they show up at our door. I understand, Haley said. Good. He stood, picked up his stool, carried it back. Then he turned around once more. I'm Bishop. We'll figure out the rest in the morning. Jackson set her up in the small room at the back of the property that had been used as a storage space at various points as overflow sleeping quarters for members passing through. It had a cot, a lamp, a space heater of its own, and a lock on the inside of the door. He showed her the lock deliberately, made sure she saw it, and didn't make any kind of speech about it. Just showed her it was there. She noticed. He could tell by the small release of tension in her shoulders, a tension so habitual she probably wasn't aware she was carrying it. Thank you, she said, standing in the doorway of the small room. Get some sleep, Jackson said. We'll talk tomorrow about whether there's actually work for you here. He turned to go. Mr. Reed. He stopped, turned back. She was looking at him with those steady eyes, and she said, I'm not going to be a problem for you. I promise. Jackson looked at her for a moment. Then he said, I know you believe that. Get some sleep, Haley. He walked back into the main garage, and for a long time after that, he sat at his workbench and didn't pick up any tools. He just sat there, thinking about the bruise on her arm and the steadiness in her voice and the particular way she'd held herself in the doorway, like someone who had gotten very, very good at making themselves small enough to not draw danger, while simultaneously refusing to disappear entirely. He'd seen a lot of things in 50 years. He couldn't quite figure out what he'd just seen. She was already awake when the first man arrived at 6:15 in the morning. Not just awake, working. Ricky Mendez, who was 26, and generally the first one to the garage in the mornings because he lived closest, came through the side door expecting to find the place exactly as they'd left it the night before. Instead, he found Haley on her hands and knees in the corner of the main workspace, reorganizing the storage shelves that had been in a state of progressive chaos for approximately 3 years. She had already, by Ricky's estimation, sorted through 4 boxes of miscellaneous parts, labeled everything in a clear hand, and created a logical system where there had previously been what he charitably would have described as organized randomness and what Bear would have called a disaster. Ricky stood in the doorway for a moment, blinking. Morning, Haley said, without looking up. What are you at 6 in the morning? I know. I couldn't sleep late. She sat back on her heels and looked at the shelf. I hope this is okay. I tried to keep everything where it logically should be, based on how it seemed like the space was used. If I got it wrong, I can redo it. You know, it's Ricky squinted at the shelf. That's where we always said we wanted to put the intake manifold sets. It made sense. They're accessed frequently enough that they should be at eye level, and the weight distribution on this side of the shelf was imbalanced anyway. So moving them actually stabilizes the whole unit. Ricky stared at her. I'll make coffee, Haley said, and got to her feet like it was the most natural thing in the world. By the time Bear arrived at 7:30, the coffee was made, the floor of the main workspace had been swept, and Haley was sitting at the battered desk in the corner that held the garage's administrative records, a sprawling, semi-organized mass of invoices, receipts, parts orders, and handwritten notes that had been accumulating for years. She had a notepad beside her. She was writing in it, steadily, with the focused attention of someone doing real work rather than appearing to do real work. Bear stopped, looked at the coffee, looked at the floor, looked at her. You started on the records, he said. I hope that's all right. I wanted to be useful. She glanced up. I found 3 invoices from the last quarter that were double charged by a supplier. A parts vendor looks like it might have been a billing error on their end, but it's also possible it was intentional. It happened on 3 separate orders on amounts just small enough that they probably assumed nobody would notice. Bear walked over to the desk slowly. The way you walk towards something you're not sure is real. How much, he said. Total overcharge across the 3 invoices, $840. She tapped the notepad. I wrote down the invoice numbers, the dates, the vendor account reference, and what I think the correct amounts should have been. You'd want someone who knows your supplier relationships better than I do to verify it before you take it to them. Bear looked at the notepad. He looked at her. He picked up the notepad. He read it. Then he said, I'll get Jackson. Jackson read the notepad twice. He looked at the original invoices, which Haley had already pulled and organized with small paper clips and numbered tabs that she'd fashioned from scraps of cardboard. Then he looked at Haley, who was standing a respectful distance away with her hands in the front pocket of her borrowed sweatshirt, waiting. You did this morning, Jackson said. Yes, before anyone else was here. Ricky was here. But yes. How long did it take you? She thought about it. About 40 minutes to go through the recent records. I recognized the pattern in the billing pretty quickly once I started seeing the dates. Jackson set the notepad down. What pattern? The overcharges all happened on orders placed on Fridays. Whoever processes the billing on the vendor side, if it's a person doing it deliberately rather than a system error they chose. Fridays because it's the end of the billing cycle and the period when errors are least likely to get caught immediately. By the time anyone reviews Friday orders, it's already the next week, and the invoice is in the past. There was silence in the garage. Bear was leaning against the wall. Bishop had arrived somewhere in the middle of this and was standing near the door, and his expression was doing something unusual. For Bishop, it was shifting, not dramatically, but in the small ways that meant he was recalibrating something. Where did you learn that? Jackson said. Haley was quiet for a moment. I grew up in a house where it was important to understand how people hide things, she said finally. I paid attention. Jackson looked at her for a long time. She held it, not with defiance, with patience. Okay, he said at last. Okay, she said. Okay, you can work here. He picked up the notepad and handed it back to her. Start by going through the last 2 years of records and flagging anything that looks wrong. Bear will show you where everything is. Bear pushed off the wall and jerked his head toward a filing cabinet. Come on then. Haley followed him. And as she passed Bishop near the door, she glanced at him briefly. Just a glance. He gave her a single small nod in return. It wasn't approval. Exactly. It was acknowledgement, which from Bishop, she was somehow already learning, was not an insignificant thing. The first week, she was careful. She did exactly what she was asked and nothing more. She came in early, stayed late, worked steadily, and spoke only when spoken to, or when she had something specific and useful to say. The men tested her in the low-level ways that people in tight communities test newcomers, giving her instructions that were slightly incomplete to see if she'd ask for clarification or blunder ahead, leaving things slightly out of place to see if she noticed, casually referencing insider terms to see if she pretended to understand them or admitted she didn't. She always asked. She always noticed. She always admitted what she didn't know. That last part mattered more than the first two. Ricky was the first one to warm to her openly, which surprised nobody, because Ricky had the least defensive architecture of anyone in the chapter. He started showing her things about the bikes, not because anyone asked him to, but because he genuinely could not be in proximity to someone who showed interest in how things worked without wanting to share what he knew. By the end of the first week, Haley could correctly identify 4 different types of engine configurations and explain the basic principles of carburetor function. Bear noticed this and said nothing about it, which was his version of approval. Bishop noticed this and said to Jackson privately, she absorbs information like she's afraid it's going to disappear. That tells you something, Jackson said. It tells me she's spent a lot of time in situations where being the only one who understood something was the difference between being okay and not being okay. Jackson was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said. That's what it tells me too. It was Bishop who found the second thing. Not in the records. Haley had been thorough there. and her audit had turned up a total of 11 billing discrepancies over 2 years, totaling just over $2,000, all from the same vendor. Jackson had already made the call, and the vendor had been almost suspiciously quick to issue a credit, which answered the question of whether it had been intentional. What Bishop found was in the small room at the back of the property. He wasn't snooping. He'd gone back to check on the secondary space heater, which had been making a noise, and Haley had been in the main garage at the time. The room was neat. She kept it extremely neat, he noticed. The kind of obsessive order that came from having lived in disorder, and he wouldn't have looked at anything except that the old notebook on the cot had fallen open onto its face. And when he picked it up to set it right, a few of the pages fanned out. He didn't read the notebook. He closed it, set it carefully back on the cot face up. But he'd seen enough in those 2 seconds to understand something important. The pages he'd glimpsed were not diary entries. They were not personal reflections. They were organized records, dates, names, times, specific details written in a compressed, precise handwriting that he recognized immediately as the handwriting of someone who had taught themselves to write small and clearly so that important information would take up as little space as possible. Someone who'd been keeping records for a long time. Someone who had been keeping records because those records were the only protection they had. He went back to the main garage and sat on his workbench and watched Haley working at the desk for a while, and he thought about the bruise on her arm, faded now after 10 days, but still visible if you knew where to look, and he thought about what she'd said that first night, that the places that looked safe weren't always the safe ones. He thought about who she was running from, and he thought that whoever it was, they were probably the kind of person who had a lot invested in nobody ever reading that notebook. She was at the garage for 12 days before first phone rang. It was the garage's main line, which almost never got outside calls. Most business came through personal contacts or the chapter's private channels. When the main line rang at 2 in the afternoon on a Wednesday, everyone in the garage looked at the phone for a moment before Bear answered it. The call was from a woman named Patricia Vance, who identified herself as an assistant to a private firm. She was looking, she said, for information about a young woman who might have passed through the Redwood Falls area. Blonde, approximately 20 years old, traveling alone. Bear looked at the phone for a moment. Then he said, "Don't know anything about that," and hung up. He walked directly to Jackson's office, which was the small windowed room at the front of the garage that had a desk and a door that closed. "We got a call," Bear said. Jackson looked up from the paper he was reading. "Someone looking for a young blonde woman. Professional inquiry." They said private firm, but the way she talked didn't sound like any private firm I've ever dealt with. Jackson was quiet. "Money behind it," Bear said. You could tell. The way she said it smooth, not urgent. Like they've made this call a lot of places, and they know one of them is going to hit eventually. Like they're not worried. Because they're used to people giving them what they want, Jackson said. Yeah. Jackson set his paper down. Through the window of his office, he could see Haley at the desk, working, not looking up. Unaware. "Lock the main line," Jackson said. "Members only calls from here. And tell Bishop I want to talk." Bear nodded and went to do it. And Jackson sat there, looking through the window at the young woman who had walked in out of the rain 12 days ago, asking for honest work. And he thought about the notebook Bishop had described, and the bruise, and the way she had said without being asked, without any preamble, "I'm not going to be a problem for you." Like she knew exactly what kind of problem she might already be, and had decided to warn him anyway. That night, after the garage had mostly cleared out, Jackson knocked on the frame of the back room doorway. Haley was sitting on the cot with the old notebook in her lap. When she heard his knock, she closed it not quickly, not like she was hiding something, but with the quiet deliberateness of someone closing a private thing. "Can I come in?" Jackson said. Yes. He came in, pulled the single chair from the corner, sat down facing her, and for a moment, neither of them said anything, and the space heater made its low, steady noise between them. Then Jackson said, "We got a phone call today. Someone looking for a young, blonde woman. Professional inquiry. Haley's expression didn't collapse. It didn't show panic. What it showed was something more complicated and more controlled than either of those things, the expression of someone who had been waiting for this and had known it was coming and had been working every day since arriving against the specific possibility of this moment. I see, she said. You want to tell me who's looking for you? She was quiet for a long moment. If I tell you, she said, it becomes your problem. And I didn't come here to give anyone a problem. Haley. Jackson leaned forward slightly. I've been running this chapter for 11 years. I've dealt with hard problems my whole life. I'm not asking because I'm worried about myself. I'm asking because whatever is in that notebook, he glanced at it briefly, then back at her. And whatever put that bruise on your arm, you've been carrying it alone for a long time. And you walked into my garage. That means something. She looked at him for a long time. Outside, the wind had picked up, and the rain that had been threatening all day was beginning to come down against the roof. And the sound of it filled the small room with a kind of white noise that made the space feel both smaller and more private. His name, Haley said quietly, is Victor Caldwell. Jackson waited. He's my stepfather, she said, and he is one of the most powerful men in this state. She paused. And the things I know about him, the things in that notebook, are the reason he will never stop looking for me. The rain came down harder against the roof. Jackson sat back in his chair. He looked at the notebook. He looked at her face. He looked at the faded marks on her arm where a man's grip had been hard enough to bruise bone deep. How long have you been keeping that notebook? He asked. Haley looked down at it in her hands. Since I was 15, she said. Jackson closed his eyes for just a moment. Then he opened them and said, okay, tell me everything. And she did. She talked for 2 hours. Jackson didn't interrupt her once. He sat in that chair with his forearms on his knees and his eyes on her face. And he listened the way that very few people in Haley's life had ever listened, not waiting for his turn to speak, not preparing his response, not deciding in advance what he believed or didn't believe. Just listening, taking it in, letting the weight of it land where it was supposed to land. She told him about her mother first. Her mother's name was Diane, and she had been the kind of woman who lit up every room she walked into without appearing to try. The kind of warmth that drew people naturally and made them feel, just by being near her, that the world was a more manageable place than it looked from a distance. Haley had her mother's hair and her mother's habit of going quiet when she was thinking hard about something, and she had spent the years since losing her trying to figure out which other pieces of herself had come from Diane and which ones she'd built on her own out of pure necessity. Diane had met Victor Caldwell when Haley was 11 years old. Victor was wealthy in the way that certain men in mid-sized American cities are wealthy, not nationally visible, but locally dominant, the kind of man whose name appeared on buildings and whose phone calls got returned before anyone else's, and who moved through the town of Crestwood with the particular ease of someone who had never once been told no by anyone who mattered. He was charming. He was polished. He paid attention to Diane in a way that she hadn't been paid attention to in years, since Haley's father had walked out when Haley was 6 and left the two of them to figure it out on their own. She was lonely, Haley said, and her voice didn't crack when she said it, but something in it flattened slightly, the way a voice does when it's carrying something too heavy to let show. She wasn't stupid. She was lonely, and he was careful about what he showed her at first. He's very good at being exactly what someone needs long enough to become necessary. They were married when Haley was 13. And for almost a year after that, she said it was fine. Not perfect, but fine. Victor ignored her more than anything, treated her like a pleasant inconvenience that came attached to the thing he actually wanted. And she was young enough that being ignored felt almost like freedom compared to the alternative. The alternative announced itself when Haley was 14. She'd been going through papers in Victor's home office, not snooping. She said she'd been looking for a permission slip that her mother had told her Victor had signed and left on his desk. And she'd found it, but she'd also found something else. A folder. Inside it, documents. Financial documents that she was too young to fully understand, but old enough to recognize were wrong in some way, numbers that didn't match, transfers between accounts with names she didn't recognize, letters that used language designed to sound legitimate while describing things that weren't. She'd put the folder back exactly where she'd found it. She hadn't said anything, but she'd started paying attention. "I didn't know what I was seeing," she told Jackson. "Not then. I just knew it was the kind of thing he wouldn't want anyone to see. So I started noticing more. And the more I noticed, the more I understood that there were two versions of Victor Caldwell. There was the one everyone saw, and there was the one my mother and I lived with. The one they lived with," she said, "was cold, controlled, precise in the particular way that very dangerous things are precise, not randomly violent, not impulsive, but surgical. He never raised his voice at Diane. He didn't need to. He had other methods. He managed what she knew and who she spoke to and how she understood the world around her so gradually and so skillfully that Diane never noticed the walls going up until they were already there. He had opinions about Haley's friends. Which ones were appropriate, which ones weren't. He had opinions about where she went and when and with whom. Opinions that, when he expressed them, came packaged as concern. Reasonable concern. The reasonable concern of a man who loved his family and wanted what was best for them. And Diane, who trusted him, took them at face value. Haley didn't. She was 15 when she started the notebook. She bought it herself, with money she'd saved from odd jobs that Victor didn't know about. At a drugstore 2 towns over when she was on a school trip. She told herself at the time that she didn't know exactly why she was doing it. She'd known, actually. She just hadn't been ready to say it out loud, even to herself. She was doing it because some part of her, the part that had been paying attention for a year and cataloging what she saw, had already understood that the most dangerous thing about Victor Caldwell wasn't what he did. It was how untouchable he was. How completely everyone around him believed in the version of himself he'd constructed. The notebook was her counter-construction, her record, her answer to the question she was already living inside. What happens to you when no one believes you? You make sure you can make them. She wrote down dates, times, specific conversations she overheard, the names of men who came to the house and were shown into Victor's study, financial things she saw or heard, amounts, counts, transfers. The small incidents, a bruise on her mother's wrist that Diane said was from a door frame. The way her mother's voice changed when Victor entered a room. The time Victor had canceled Diane's credit cards without telling her. And then, when Diane had been confused and embarrassed at a checkout counter, told her it had been a bank error and fixed it within the hour. So smooth, so quick, so perfectly framed as him solving a problem that Diane had thanked him. Haley had eaten that one down too. My mother believed he loved her, Haley told Jackson. Her voice was completely flat now, the flatness of someone who had processed a grief so many times it had worn smooth, and maybe some version of him did. But what he did to her, the way he slowly made sure she couldn't trust her own judgment about anything, the way he made her smaller and smaller, without her ever seeing it happening, she stopped, drew a breath. That's not love. I don't care what word you put on it. Jackson said nothing. He just held the space for her to keep going. She told him about the night her mother died. Haley was 17. Victor and Diane had gone to a charity event, one of the many events on the social calendar of a man like Victor Caldwell. The kind of event where photographs got taken and names got mentioned in the right circles. Haley had stayed home. She was used to staying home by then. She heard the car in the driveway at 11:30, and then voices, and then a long silence, and then Victor's car leaving again. And she'd thought that was strange because her mother's voice had sounded wrong, not upset, not frightened, just wrong, an edge in it that she hadn't heard before. She'd gone downstairs. She'd found her mother at the bottom of the staircase. The official account was that Diane had fallen. She'd been drinking at the event. There were witnesses who confirmed she'd had wine. 2 glasses, maybe 3. The staircase was steep. It was a terrible accident. Victor was devastated. Victor handled everything. Victor stood at the funeral and talked about his wife with tears on his face that Haley had watched with the particular clarity of a person seeing something for exactly what it was. She had gone back to the notebook that night. She had written down every single thing she remembered from the previous 24 hours. Every detail, the time, the voices, the quality of her mother's voice, the length of the silence, the sound of Victor's car leaving, the position her mother had been in when Haley found her. She wrote it all down in her small, careful handwriting, and she sat on her bedroom floor and she did not cry because she understood, somewhere below thought and above instinct, that if she was going to survive what came next, she was going to need every piece of herself functional. She was 17 years old. Jackson was quiet for a long time after that. He knew you saw things, he finally said. It wasn't a question. Not everything. Not the notebook. But he knew I didn't believe the story about what happened to my mother. And he knew I wasn't like her. I wasn't manageable the same way. She paused. I think that scared him more than anything else. What did he do? He kept me close, she said. That's the smart play, right? If you can't be sure what someone knows, you make sure there's somewhere you can watch them. He paid for my college. Local college, nothing too far. He gave me money, kept me comfortable. He was generous in all the visible ways. Her jaw tightened. And every time I tried to say something to anyone, a counselor at school, a friend's parent, anyone, it never went anywhere. Because Victor Caldwell was the most respected man in Crestwood, and I was the troubled stepdaughter who'd never fully recovered from her mother's death. He made sure of that. He made sure that was the story before I ever got to tell mine. The bruise on your arm, Jackson said quietly. Haley looked down at the faded marks. I told him I was leaving. 3 weeks ago, I told him I'd found a place to go, that I was done, that I wasn't going to stay anymore. I didn't tell him about the notebook. I didn't tell him what I intended to do with it. She paused. He grabbed me, just for a moment, long enough to make the point. And then he let go, and he was calm again, and he said, she stopped. What did he say? He said, you have nowhere to go, Haley, and even if you did, no one is going to listen to a word you say. So you should think very carefully about what you're doing. She looked up at Jackson. He was almost right about the first part. Jackson leaned back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then he looked at her. Almost, he said. Almost, she agreed. He didn't tell her what to do that night. He didn't make promises or declarations or lay out plans. He said goodnight, and he went home. And he went home. And he sat at a 17-year-old girl sitting on a bedroom floor after finding her mother at the bottom of a staircase, writing everything down in a small notebook, because she'd already understood that evidence was the only protection she had. In the morning, he called Bishop. Bishop came in early, before anyone else, and Jackson told him most of it, not everything, not the details that weren't his to share, but enough. And Bishop listened with that particular focused stillness of his, and when Jackson was done, Bishop was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the notebook. Yeah, how detailed? 5 years of detail, Jackson said, from when she was 15 to when she left 3 weeks ago. Bishop processed this. Financial records, witness names, dates, and what happened to her mother. Another silence. Victor Caldwell, Bishop said, like he was tasting the name, assessing it. You know him? I know the name. Everyone in this region knows the name. Jackson. He's got his hand in half the development projects between here and the state capitol. He's on 3 charitable foundations. He's had dinner at the governor's table. Bishop paused. He's the kind of man who can make a phone call and have this garage shut down inside of a month if he decides he wants to. I know that, Jackson said. And you're still talking to me about how we help her. I am. Bishop was quiet for one more moment. Then he said, I need to see that notebook. That's her call. Then you need to ask her. Haley said yes. She didn't say it immediately. She sat with it for the better part of a day, working steadily at the desk, not visibly troubled, but thinking hard the way she thought hard, which was quietly and completely turning something over and examining every face of it before committing to a direction. At 4 p.m, she came to Jackson's office doorway and said, I'll show Bishop the notebook. But I want to be there. Of course, Jackson said. And I want him to understand something first. What? This isn't a favor I'm asking. I'm not putting this in anyone's hands and asking them to handle it for me. Her voice was steady and precise. I've been building this for 5 years. It's mine. I know what's in it better than anyone. Whatever happens next, I'm part of it. I'm not sitting in a back room while other people decide what to do with my own evidence. Jackson looked at her for a moment. Understood, he said. Good, she said, and went back to the desk. Bear was nearby, pretending he hadn't heard any of that. He picked up a wrench and went back to the engine he was working on, but his expression had shifted in the almost imperceptible way that meant he was feeling something he hadn't quite found the word for yet. Ricky, who absolutely had heard all of it and wasn't pretending otherwise, looked at Haley with something close to open and admiration. She didn't notice, because she was already working again. Bishop read the notebook that evening. He read it the way he did everything systematically, without rushing, going back to check specific entries against other entries, building the picture in his head the way you build a case rather than the way you tell a story. He asked questions as he went, and Haley answered them, sitting across from him at the workbench, with her hands folded in front of her and her eyes steady. What struck Bishop, reading it, was not the volume of information, though the volume was significant. What struck him was the precision. She had never speculated in the notebook. She had never written down what she thought or felt or feared. She had written only what she had directly observed, heard or seen documentation of. Each tree was dated. Many were timed. The financial entries referenced specific document numbers that she had either photographed or, in a few cases, transcribed verbatim. A lawyer reading this would see something useful. An investigator reading this would see a foundation. Bishop reading this saw something else too, the record of a teenager, then a young woman, methodically building her own life, raft out of facts, while the water rose around her, alone for 5 years, with no guarantee that anyone would ever read it. He closed the notebook and set it carefully on the workbench between them. You told anyone else about this, he said. No, not a teacher, not a friend. No, why not? She looked at him without blinking. Because the first time you tell someone and they don't believe you, Victor finds out you told them. And then your situation gets worse. And then the next person you try to tell, he's already there first. He's already set the narrative. She paused. I watched him do it to my mother, over years, before she even understood what was happening to her. I wasn't going to let him do it to me. Bishop was quiet. So you waited, he said. I built, she said. There's a difference. He looked at her for a long moment. The financial records in here, he said. The transfers. The account names, do you know what they're from? Do you have any sense of what the underlying business is? Some of it, she said. There are 2 development companies that I could never find legitimate project records for. Money goes into them, and the amounts are too regular to be project-based revenue. It's too consistent, like a maintenance income. But the companies don't have properties I could find on record. Shell companies, Bishop said. Possibly. Or companies that exist on paper to move money somewhere else. Bishop nodded slowly. The names in here, the men who came to the house, some of them I recognize later. One of them is a county commissioner. One runs a logistics company out of Fremont. The third one I've never been able to identify, but he came 4 times over 3 years, and Victor always made sure I wasn't nearby when he was there. The one time I was accidentally still in the house when he arrived, Victor sent me out for groceries with enough money to stay gone for 2 hours. Bishop picked the notebook back up, turned to a specific page. Read it again. This entry, he said, and pointed. August 5 years ago. Haley leaned forward slightly to see. The meeting in the study. You wrote down part of a conversation. I was in the hallway. The door wasn't completely closed. I wrote it down as soon as I got back to my room. Bishop read it again quietly. Then he said, do you know what this means? This specific exchange? I know what it sounds like, Haley said carefully. It sounds like someone confirming payment for something that isn't a normal business transaction. Yes. And it sounds like whoever was confirming it had a position that would make the payment particularly Significant. Yes, she said again. Bishop set the notebook down very gently. He looked at Jackson, who had been standing near the door through all of this, listening. We need a lawyer, Bishop said. Not just any lawyer. I know someone, Jackson said. Someone trustworthy genuinely? Yeah. Jackson held his gaze. Genuinely. Bishop turned back to Haley. There are people in this notebook who will not want it read. People who have resources and reach and who will put significant effort into making sure this never becomes public. You understand that? I've understood that for 5 years, Haley said. That's why I kept it. If we move forward with this, if we take this to the right people and start building something real around what you have, it's going to become dangerous faster than it's already been. Because right now, Victor Caldwell is looking for you, but he doesn't know what you have. The moment he finds out about the notebook, the calculation changes. Haley held his gaze without flinching. He's already looking for me. The phone call you got proves that. Doing nothing doesn't make it safer. It just means he gets more time. Bishop was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that, from Bishop, was significant. She's right. The next morning, Haley arrived to find Bear at the desk where she usually worked. This was unusual enough that she stopped short just inside the door. Bear looked up. He had a piece of paper in front of him and a coffee beside it, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who had decided something and was slightly uncomfortable about having decided it, but not planning to reverse course. Sit down, he said. She sat down across from him. I know about the situation, Bear said. Jackson told me the outline. Not everything, I don't need everything. But I know who's looking for you, and I know what you have, and I know what the chapter is considering. Okay, she said. I want you to hear something from me specifically, Bear said. He looked down at the paper in front of him, then back up at her. 22 years ago, my daughter, she was 18. She had a situation with someone who had money and reach, and who made sure nobody listened to her when she tried to talk about what he'd done to her. He stopped. His jaw moved slightly. I didn't handle it right. I didn't know how. I didn't know what the right move was. And I waited too long to try to find out. And the right moment passed. And it's something I have carried every day since then. Haley sat very still. I'm not telling you that for sympathy, Bear said. I'm telling you so you understand that when I say we are going to handle this right, I mean it from a specific place, not just principle, not just because Jackson decided. He met her eyes. Because I know what it costs when someone with everything on the line doesn't get backed up. The garage was very quiet. Haley said, I'm sorry about your daughter. She's okay now, Bear said. She got there on her own, eventually. But she shouldn't have had to. He picked up his coffee. You're not going to have to. He stood up and walked back toward the engine bays, and Haley sat at the desk for a moment, alone. And for the first time since she'd walked in out of the rain, she allowed her eyes to fill just briefly, just for a moment before she blinked it back and picked up a pen and got to work. The lawyer's name was Ruth Kavanaugh. She was 61 years old, small, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of precise economy of movement that belonged to someone who had spent decades in situations where every word and every gesture carried consequence. She had been a public defender for 12 years, a civil rights attorney for 15, and had spent the last several years doing exactly the kind of work that made people like Victor Caldwell deeply uncomfortable. Jackson had known her for a long time, through channels he didn't need to detail, and what he knew about her could be summarized simply. She was the most genuinely unintimidatable person he had ever met. She came to the garage on a Thursday afternoon. She shook Jackson's hand, nodded at Bear and Bishop, introduced herself to Haley with the direct warmth of someone who had no time for performance, but genuine interest in the person in front of her. And then she sat down at the desk with the notebook and spent 45 minutes reading it without saying a word to anyone. When she was done, she looked up. This is real, she said, to no one in particular and everyone present. Yes, Haley said. You wrote all of this. Every word. Ruth looked at her for a moment with an expression that was assessing but not unkind. How old were you when you started? 15. Ruth was quiet for one beat. Then, You have two things here, maybe three. The financial irregularities, some of this is potentially enough to trigger a serious inquiry if it reaches the right office. The other thing, she stopped, chose her words, the account of the night your mother died. Taken in isolation, it's your testimony. Combined with these entries about the pattern of behavior over the preceding 2 years, it's considerably more significant. Can it be used? Jackson asked from across the garage. That depends on what we build around it and who we bring in. Ruth set the notebook down carefully. What I will tell you right now is that this notebook needs to be in two places. It needs to be preserved as it is, original copy, and it needs to be digitized and encrypted and stored somewhere that isn't accessible to Victor Caldwell or anyone working for him. She looked at Haley. Does he know this exists? No, you're certain? He knew I watched things. He didn't know I wrote them down. Then we have a window, Ruth said. But it is not a wide one. The phone call to this garage that tells me he's casting a systematic net. He's looking for her methodically, which means he's not panicked yet, but he is determined. The moment he finds her, his first question is going to be what she has. And the moment he asks that question, he'll know about the notebook, Bishop said. He'll suspect. And a man with his resources and his reasons will act on suspicion without waiting for confirmation. Ruth looked around the garage. At Jackson. At Bear, at Bishop, at Haley. So what are we doing? Nobody hesitated. We're moving forward, Jackson said. Ruth nodded. Once, like that was what she'd expected, and she approved of the efficiency of it. She picked up a legal pad from her bag. Then let's start with the financial records, she said, and build from there. Haley, I need you to walk me through each of the account entries in sequence and tell me everything you remember about the context, what you saw, what you heard, when, what else was happening in the house at the time. Don't leave anything out, even things that seem small. Haley pulled her chair closer to the desk. Okay, she said. Where do you want me to start? The beginning, Ruth said, and Haley started talking. 3 days after Ruth's visit, a black SUV with tinted windows parked on Millbrook Road, 200 yards from the garage entrance, for 4 hours. Ricky noticed it first. He mentioned it to Bear. Bear walked outside, looked at it for 10 seconds, came back inside, and told Jackson. Jackson went to his office and made a phone call. He spoke for about 2 minutes and then came back out. It's registered to a security firm out of Crestwood, he said. Nobody needed to hear the rest of that sentence. Bishop looked at Haley, who had stopped working and was standing still with her hands flat on the desk. Hey, Bishop said. She looked at him. He doesn't know what you have. He just knows where you are. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were level. And then, after a moment, she nodded a small, precise nod that said she understood exactly what he meant and was making the adjustment in real time, recalibrating fear into information, the way she had taught herself to do for 5 years. Does Ruth know? She asked. I'll call her right now, Jackson said. Good. Haley looked down at the desk, then back up. Then let's not waste any more time. Outside, the SUV stayed where it was. Inside, the garage kept working. Ruth Kavanaugh answered on the first ring. And Haley Morgan, who was not, as they were all starting to understand more fully with every passing day. Her real name opened the notebook to a fresh page and picked up a pen, because there were still things to write down. And she was not done yet. The SUV came back the next morning. Same spot, same tinted windows, same deliberate stillness that was designed to communicate exactly one thing, that Victor Caldwell knew where she was and that he was patient enough to wait. Haley was already at the desk when Ricky came in and told her. She nodded once, made a note of the time in the margin of her legal pad, and kept working. Ricky stood there for a moment watching her write, and then he said quietly, "Doesn't that scare you?" She looked up. "Yes," she said. "That's why I'm working faster." He didn't have anything to say to that. He went and told Bear, and Bear went and stood at the front window for a minute looking at the SUV. And his expression was the expression of a man doing arithmetic, calculating distance, calculating what the presence of that vehicle meant in practical terms, calculating what the next move was before someone else made it first. Jackson was on the phone with Ruth by 7:30. Ruth had been expecting the call. She'd already made 2 of her own. He's sending a message, Ruth said. He wants her rattled. He wants her to do something reactive, reach out to him. Run again. Make a mistake. She's not going to do any of those things, Jackson said. I know that. But he doesn't know that yet. A pause, which is actually the window we're working in right now. He thinks she's alone and scared and without resources. He doesn't know about the notebook's documentation. If he did, he wouldn't be sitting in an SUV on the street. He'd be moving a lot faster and a lot harder. How long before he figures it out? Depends on what his people are telling him. But Jackson, we need to accelerate. I've been in contact with a former investigator I trust completely. His name is Dale Whitmore. He spent 20 years in financial crimes before he went independent. I want him to look at the account records in that notebook. When? Today, if possible. Jackson looked through his office window at Haley, who was doing exactly what she'd said, working faster. I'll make it happen, he said. Dale Whitmore arrived at 2 in the afternoon in a battered pickup that looked like it belonged to a man who repaired fences for a living, which Jackson suspected was not entirely accidental. He was 55, compact, with a quiet face and hands that moved with the deliberate patience of someone who spent most of his professional life in the space between what was documented and what was real. He shook hands with Jackson, nodded at Bishop, acknowledged Bear, with the comfortable ease of a man used to being in rooms where the atmosphere was guarded, and sat down across from Haley without preamble. Ruth says you've been keeping financial records for 5 years, he said. Yes. Walk me through what you understood about what you were seeing when you recorded it. Haley opened the notebook. She talked for 40 minutes without stopping, going entry by entry through the financial records she'd compiled, the account names, the transfer amounts, the frequency patterns she'd noticed, the 2 shell companies that had no visible legitimate operations, the name of the logistics company in Fremont, whose owner had visited Victor's home 3 times in 18 months. Dale listened without writing anything down, which Haley noticed and appreciated. He was building the map in his head first, understanding the shape of it before he started marking points. When she finished, he was quiet for about 30 seconds. Then he said, the 2 companies, Eastbridge Holdings and Clearwater Development. Yes, you said the income pattern was too regular for project-based revenue. The amounts came in on the same day every month. Projects don't pay that way. Projects have milestone payments, variable timelines. This was structured like a subscription. Dale looked at her steadily. You figured that out at what age? 16, she said. When I noticed it and you wrote it down. Every time. He was quiet again. Then he turned to Jackson. Eastbridge Holdings was dissolved 14 months ago. Clearwater was restructured and renamed. But both left paper trails in the state business registry that are technically public record. He paused. If those trails connect to the names and amounts in this notebook, we have the beginning of something that a federal financial crimes unit would find very interesting. The word federal landed in the garage like a stone into still water. Bishop, from his position near the wall, said, You're saying this goes above the county level. I'm saying the amounts and the structure suggest it was designed to survive county-level scrutiny, Dale said, which means whoever built it understood the county system well enough to account for it. That's not amateur work. Victor has relationships with the county commissioner's office, Haley said. Her voice was steady. There's an entry in the notebook. One of the men who came to the house, I identified him later as a deputy commissioner. Dale turned back to her. Which entry? She turned to the page without hesitating. She'd had the notebook memorized for years. He read it. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture did a very slight forward shift. The body language of a person who has just confirmed something they suspected and understood its significance. Okay, he said. He picked up his pen for the first time. Start from the beginning of the financial section again. This time I'm going to write. They worked for 3 more hours. By the time Dale left, he had 12 pages of his own notes and the names of 2 colleagues at the federal level he intended to contact through back channels before making anything official. He shook Haley's hand at the door and held it for a moment. You did something very difficult. he said, for a very long time. Alone, she met his eyes. I didn't have a choice. You had a choice, he said. Plenty of people in your situation make a different one. They survive by forgetting, or by deciding the risk isn't worth it. He paused. You decided it was. She didn't answer that. But after he left, she stood at the door for a moment before turning back to the garage, and the expression on her face was one that none of the men who saw it could quite name. It wasn't relief. Exactly. It wasn't triumph. It was the expression of a person who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has just been told, for the first time by someone qualified to say it, that the weight was real, that they hadn't been imagining it, that it mattered. The SUV was gone when Haley looked. She told Jackson, who told Bishop, who said, that's not better. That means they got what they needed from the surveillance and they're moving to the next stage. Which is? Ricky asked. Direct contact, Bishop said. He was right. He was right by about 18 hours. The next morning, at 9:15, a man in a suit walked into the garage like he owned the address and everything attached to it. He was mid-40s, professionally groomed, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the particular expression of a man who was accustomed to arriving places and having them immediately reconfigure themselves around his presence. He looked at Bear, who was the first person he encountered, and said, I'm looking for the owner, Jackson Reed. He's busy, Bear said. I'll wait. You'll also need a reason, Bear said pleasantly, in the tone of voice that sounded pleasant while communicating something entirely different. The man reached into his portfolio and produced a business card. He held it out. Bear took it without looking at it. My name is Gerald Marsh, the man said. I represent the Caldwell Family Trust. We're looking for a young woman named Haley Caldwell, also known as Haley Morgan, who we believe may have come through this area recently. Her family is very concerned about her well-being. From the desk in the corner, Haley heard every word. She did not move. She did not make a sound. Don't know anyone by that name, Bear said. Mr. Reed, I'm authorized to. I said I get Jackson, Bear said. Still in that same pleasant voice. I didn't say you could talk to me while you wait. Marsh stopped. He recalibrated. He said, of course, and stood near the door in the specific way of someone who was memorizing the space, its layout, who was in it, where the exits were. Bear walked directly to the back of the garage. He came around to the desk's blind angle, the position where he was visible to Haley, but not to Marsh, and he looked at her and said, with no more volume than necessary, bathroom. Now, stay there until I come for you. She moved immediately. No hesitation, no questions. She picked up the notebook from the desk. That was the only thing she took. And she walked through the back of the garage and through the door that led to the rear of the property, and she did not look at Marsh as she went. Jackson came out of his office 2 minutes later. He walked up to Marsh with the particular patience of a man who has never in his life been hurried by someone else's schedule. Jackson Reed, he said. He did not offer his hand. Marsh introduced himself again, repeated the part about the Caldwell Family Trust, repeated the part about the young woman. Added this time, Mr. Caldwell is prepared to be generous with anyone who can help locate her and confirm she's safe. Generous, Jackson repeated. He's her family. He's worried. Uh-huh. Jackson looked at the business card Bear had handed him. Mr. Marsh, I run a motorcycle garage. I've got 5 bikes to get through today and 2 men out sick. I don't have time to help locate missing persons, and I don't know anyone named Haley Caldwell or Haley Morgan. He handed the card back. If she turns up, I'll be sure to reach out. Marsh looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating again. He took the card. He looked around the garage one more time, the deliberate look of a man filing information. Then he said, of course. Thank you for your time. He walked out. His car, another black SUV, different plates, pulled away from the curb with no urgency. Jackson turned to Bear. Ruth, Jackson said. Already texting her, Bear said. And Bishop needs to know the timeline just moved. Yep. Jackson walked to the back of the property and knocked on the bathroom door and said, he's gone. The door opened. Haley came out. She was holding the notebook against her chest with both arms, the way you hold something you cannot afford to lose. What did he say? She asked. Jackson told her, precise and unedited. She listened to all of it. He described it as a family concern, she said when Jackson was done. Yes. Victor doesn't have family left who would be concerned. My mother is dead. I'm the only child. The trust is a legal entity he controls. She paused. He's using the language of family welfare because it's the most sympathetic framing. If he has to escalate to legal action, that framing becomes useful. It frames me as someone who needs to be found for her own good, instead of someone who needs to stay hidden from him for her own good, Bishop said from behind Jackson. Yes, Haley said. The three of them stood there for a moment. This is moving faster than we expected, Bishop said. I know, Haley said. What's the next step with Ruth? She's filing preliminary documentation today, creating a record that you're here voluntarily, that you're safe, that you're an adult with full legal autonomy. It makes the concerned family framing harder to operate under. That's the legal side, Haley said. What about the other side? Jackson and Bishop looked at each other. It was Bishop who answered. Dale called this morning. Before Marsh showed up, Bishop paused. He reached out to his federal contact last night. The contact knows the name Caldwell, not from the financial crimes angle, from something else. Something Dale didn't have full details on, but that his contact confirmed was already on the edge of their awareness. The garage was very quiet. What does that mean? Haley said. It means you're not the first person to have concerns about Victor Caldwell, Bishop said. It means someone else has been looking from a different direction for longer than we have. He held her gaze. It means what's in your notebook might be the piece they've been missing. Haley sat with that for the rest of the day. She worked. She always worked. It was how she thought, having her hands occupied with something real while her mind worked through the architecture of things. She went through the garage's records with the part of her attention that ran on automatic pilot, flagging discrepancies and organizing documents, and with the other part, she turned over what Bishop had said, examining it from every angle, looking for the catches and the risks, the way she trained herself to look for catches and risks in everything. There was one thing she kept returning to. One thing that mattered more than the federal angle, more than Marsh's visit, more than the timing of the SUV or the language of the Caldwell family trust. She went to Jackson's office at 5 o'clock and stood in the doorway. There's something I didn't put in the notebook, she said. Jackson looked up from what he was doing. I kept it out because it's not documented evidence. It's testimony. It's my account of something I directly witnessed. But I'm the only witness. She paused. I was afraid that without documentation it would be the most dismissible thing, that it would give Victor's people something to attack. Look at the unstable stepdaughter, making unsupported accusations. I thought the financial records were safer to lead with because they're verifiable. Okay, Jackson said quietly. What is it? She came into the office and sat down. She set the notebook on his desk but didn't open it. She'd carried this outside the notebook for 7 years, carried it in the place in her memory that didn't have pages, and that was where it had stayed. The night my mother died, Haley said, I told you I heard voices when they came home. I told you I heard my mother's voice sound wrong. What I didn't tell you. She stopped, steadied. I went to the top of the staircase before I went down. I heard them in the entryway below. I couldn't see them from where I was, but I could hear. Victor was talking. I couldn't make out all of it, but I heard the end. He said his exact words, and I have replayed them 10,000 times in my head. He said, you don't actually have a choice in this, Diane. You never did. The office was completely silent. And then, Haley said, I heard the sound of her falling. Jackson didn't move. I didn't go down immediately. I was 17, and I was terrified. And I stood at the top of the stairs, and I heard him below. And I heard him pick up his phone, and I heard him say to whoever he called that there had been a terrible accident, and his wife had fallen, and his voice. She stopped again, let a breath out. His voice was calm. It was completely calm. Not the calm of someone in shock. The calm of someone executing a plan. She looked at Jackson. I have carried that for 7 years, she said, and I never put it in the notebook because I thought no one would believe me. I thought it would just be the thing that made everything else look like the delusions of a traumatized teenager. Jackson's expression had not changed, but his eyes had. Something had moved behind them, deep and slow, like a geological shift rather than a surface reaction. "You believe me," she said. Not a question. "Yes," he said immediately. "Why? You only have my word." Because Jackson said, with a quietness that carried more weight than volume would have, "I have your word and 5 years of that notebook and the way you came in that door, and the way you've worked every day since. And nobody who is constructing a fantasy operates the way you operate. Nobody who is lying is this precise." He paused. "And because I have spent 50 years reading people, Haley, you are telling the truth. I have known it since the first night." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Ruth needs to know, yes. And Dale's federal contact, yes, even though I'm the only witness. Even though Victor's people will come at it with everything they have." "Especially then," Jackson said. "Because here's what I know about the truth, Haley. It doesn't need to stand alone. It needs to stand alongside everything else you have. One testimony from a 17-year-old girl is dismissible. One testimony from a 20-year-old woman, supported by 5 years of meticulous records and a pattern of financial irregularity that a federal investigator finds significant, and a body of evidence that took a decade to construct, that is a different thing entirely." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm scared," she said. It was the first time she'd said that word aloud since she'd arrived, and it landed in the room differently than any other thing she'd said because it was the truest thing, the one she'd kept most carefully below the surface. "I know," Jackson said, "not of Victor. I've been scared of Victor for 7 years. I know how to work scared." She looked at her hands on the desk. "I'm scared that we get this close and it still doesn't matter. That his money and his connections and the story he's told about me for years are still enough to make it not matter." Jackson leaned forward. "Let me tell you something about Victor Caldwell," he said. "Men like Victor Caldwell are powerful because people give them the power. They work in systems where everyone around them has already decided who has authority and who doesn't, and they maintain that advantage by making sure the people who could challenge them feel alone." He held her gaze. "You came in this door 3 weeks ago. You are not alone anymore." She held his gaze for a long moment, and then she nodded the same small, precise nod he'd seen before. The one that meant she was integrating something, moving it from outside herself to inside. "Okay," she said. "Call Ruth." Ruth came that evening with Dale on the phone via speaker. The conversation lasted 90 minutes. Haley gave her account of the night Diane died, not from the notebook, from memory, with the same precision she applied to everything. And Ruth asked questions, and Dale asked questions, and Haley answered all of them without flinching and without embellishment, just the facts, just the sequence, just the words she had heard and the sounds that followed. When she was done, there was a silence on the phone line. Then Dale said, "The federal contact I spoke to. He's going to need to hear this directly. Not from me, from you." "When?" Haley asked. "Soon as we can arrange it." "Then let's arrange it," Ruth said. "Haley, I need to prepare you for something. When this moves into official channels, Victor Caldwell is going to respond, immediately and aggressively. His legal team is going to move to discredit you. They're going to use everything your age when this started, the fact that you left voluntarily, the fact that you've been using a different name. They're going to try to build a picture of someone who is unstable and motivated by personal grievance." "I know," Haley said. "And it's going to be hard, even with everything you have." "I know that too." Haley looked at the notebook on the table in front of her. "But here's what they don't have. They don't have this. 7 years of dates and names and amounts and conversations, in my own handwriting, recorded in real time while I was living inside it. They don't have Dale's financial analysis. They don't have whatever your federal contact already knows about Caldwell from the other direction." She paused. "They have money and lawyers and the story Victor has been telling for years. We have the truth, documented." She let that sit for a moment. "I'll take that trade." Ruth's voice, when it came, was warm with something that went past professional respect. "All right," she said. "Then here's what we're doing next." She laid it out clearly and methodically, the documentation Ruth was filing, the protective legal records she was establishing, the coordination with Dale's federal contact, the timeline they were working against. Given that Marsh's visit had indicated Victor's people were accelerating. Every piece had a purpose, every step connected to the next. Haley listened to all of it, and when Ruth was finished, she asked 3 specific, precise questions that Ruth answered with the respect of one sharp mind for another. After the call, the garage was quiet. Bear and Ricky had stayed not because anyone asked them to, but because leaving hadn't occurred to them. Bishop was at his workbench, not working on anything, just present. Ricky said, into the quiet. What do we do right now? Tonight, it was Bear who answered. Tonight, Bear said, we make sure nothing happens to that notebook. He looked at Jackson. I want it copied. Digital backup encrypted. Ruth's office and somewhere else we control. Agreed, Jackson said. And I want someone here overnight. He looked around. I'll take first shift. I don't need, Hala started. I know you don't need it, Bear said, in the tone of a man who has already moved past the part of the conversation where that point was relevant. We need it, she stopped. Looked at him. Okay, she said. Bishop was on his feet and collecting his jacket when his phone rang. He looked at the screen. His expression shifted in a way that snapped every head in the room toward him. It's my contact at the county, he said. Give me a minute. He stepped away and spoke for less than 90 seconds. When he came back, the quality silence around him was different. Gerald Marsh filed a report this afternoon, Bishop said, with the county sheriff's office. He reported a young woman who he claims is emotionally disturbed and possibly a danger to herself. He named Haley Caldwell. He stated she was last seen in the vicinity of this garage. The room was very still. He's trying to get a welfare check, Jackson said. More than that, Bishop said. He's creating a legal record that she's unstable. Before she can create one that says otherwise. Everyone understood immediately what that meant. Victor wasn't waiting anymore. He was moving. And he was moving smart, trying to get his version of Haley into the official record before Ruth's documentation could establish hers. Haley stood up from her chair. Her face was composed. Her hands were steady. How much time do we have? She asked. Bishop said, if they process it tonight, a deputy could come by tomorrow morning. Then Ruth needs to know in the next 10 minutes, she said. And the documentation she's filing needs to go in tonight, not tomorrow. She picked up the notebook from the table. And someone called Dale, she said, because we just lost whatever window we thought we had. She was already moving toward Jackson's office before anyone else had spoken. Because that was who Haley Caldwell was, not the frightened girl Victor Caldwell had spent years trying to make her into, but the woman she'd built herself into in spite of him. The one who knew, from the bone outward, that when the wall comes at you, you don't wait for it to arrive. You run straight at it first. Ruth answered on the first ring. She listened to Bishop's account of the Marsh filing without interrupting, and when he was done, she said, with the precise calm of someone shifting from preparation to execution, how long ago did he file it? My contact says mid-afternoon, around 3. Then we have a window. County processing on welfare check requests runs 8 to 12 hours on average, depending on the shift load. That means we have until early morning before a deputy acts on it. A brief pause, papers moving in the background. I've been drafting the protective documentation all day. I can have it filed digitally tonight. There's a duty clerk at the courthouse who can timestamp it for the record. It won't stop a welfare check, but it creates a legal record that Haley is here voluntarily, that she is an adult in full possession of her faculties, and that she has legal representation. That completely reframes what a responding deputy finds when they arrive. Do it, Jackson said. I already started the moment. Bishop said Marsh's name. More paper sounds. Put Haley on. Haley took the phone. She stood in Jackson's office with her back straight and the notebook under her arm, and she listened to Ruth for 2 minutes without speaking. Then she said, I understand. Then she said, Ruth, thank you. She handed the phone back to Jackson and looked at the people in the room around her. Bear, arms crossed, waiting. Bishop, standing near the door, watchful. Ricky, younger than all of them, and the most visibly tense, leaning against the wall with the expression of someone who wanted desperately to do something useful and was still figuring out what that was. Ruth is filing tonight, Haley said. The welfare check becomes a lot less useful for Victor once there's a legal record with a timestamp that predates the deputy's arrival. She looked at Jackson. But it buys us time, not safety. Victor is going to understand within 24 hours that the legal approach isn't going to be enough. When that happens, he'll go to the next thing. What's the next thing? Ricky asked. Pressure, Haley said, on this garage, on the people here. He has resources and reach, and he'll start using them in ways that are designed to make helping me too costly to continue. She paused. I need you all to understand that. What you're taking on by staying in this. The silence that followed was brief. Bear uncrossed his arms. I told you something 2 days ago about my daughter, he said. I meant every word of it. Cost doesn't change that. Bishop said, I've known what this was since the first night you described that notebook to me. I haven't changed my mind, Ricky said. I'm 26. I have no family to pressure and nothing Victor Caldwell would want to take. He shrugged with the particular defiance of someone young enough to say a thing like that and mean it all the way through. So he's welcome to try. Jackson said nothing. He just looked at Haley in the way that communicated everything, and she looked back at him, and she nodded once. Okay, she said. Then let's talk about what happens in the morning. The deputy arrived at 8:17. He was young, early 30s. Professional, clearly uncomfortable with the assignment in the specific way of a person who understood, on some level, that they were being used as a tool for something they hadn't fully been shown. His name was Deputy Carver, and he introduced himself to Jackson at the garage entrance with the careful courtesy of someone trying to conduct an awkward task without making it worse than it needed to be. I have a welfare check request filed yesterday afternoon, he said. For a Haley Caldwell, also possibly known as Haley Morgan, I know, Jackson said. Our attorney anticipated this. She filed documentation with the county clerk last night. He held out a copy of Ruth's papers. Haley is here voluntarily. She's an adult, she's safe, and she has legal representation. Deputy Carver took the papers. He read them. His expression shifted slightly, the expression of a man whose job just became both simpler and more complicated. I'll still need to speak with her directly, he said. Standard procedure for a welfare check. Of course, Jackson said, and stepped aside. Haley was already standing in the middle of the garage, and she had dressed that morning with the deliberateness of someone who understood that appearances carry information. She was composed, alert, and she looked at Deputy Carver with the direct, steady gaze that was simply who she was, but that, in this context, communicated exactly what needed to be communicated. This is not a person in distress. This is not a person who needs rescuing. This is a person who knows exactly where she is and why. Haley Morgan, Carver said. Yes, she said. Haley Morgan is the name I've been using. My legal name is Haley Caldwell. I'm 20 years old. I'm here voluntarily. I'm safe. He went through the standard questions. Was she in any danger? Was she under any duress? Did she want to contact any family members? She answered each one calmly and completely. Then she said, Deputy Carver, I want to tell you something that isn't in your welfare check request. The man who filed it, he filed it through a representative named Gerald Marsh, who represents the Caldwell Family Trust. Victor Caldwell is my stepfather. I left his home 3 weeks ago because I am an adult and I chose to. I have legal representation, and I am in the process of working with that representation on matters I'm not able to discuss in detail. The welfare check was filed to create a record suggesting I'm unstable. She paused. I'm telling you this not to interfere with your job, but because you deserve to know the full context of what you were sent here to do. Carver looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the papers in his hand. He looked at Jackson, then back at her. Then he said, Is there anything you need from law enforcement right now? Anything I can help with? Not right now, she said. But thank you for asking. He left 15 minutes later. He filed his welfare check response as subject located, adult voluntary safe, represented by counsel, no action required. Victor Caldwell's first legal move had just bounced off. Jackson called Ruth the moment Carver's car left the lot. Ruth listened to the account and said, "Good. Now listen to me carefully, because the next part is important. Victor is going to receive that welfare check response within hours. He's going to know the legal angle is compromised. That means the pressure campaign Bishop predicted is starting today, possibly by this afternoon." A pause. "I heard from Dale this morning. His federal contact, his name is Agent Raymond Cho. He's based out of the Regional Financial Crimes Office. He wants a direct conversation with Haley, not through intermediaries. He's been building a parallel inquiry into a network of financial irregularities in this region for 14 months, and 3 of the names in Haley's notebook appear in his existing case file." The pause followed that statement was long enough that you had to confirm he was still on the line. "3 names, Jackson said. 3 names that Haley recorded between 4 and 6 years ago, independently, before any federal inquiry existed," Ruth said. "Which means her records potentially predate their documentation. Which means she may have evidence they don't." Jackson turned and looked across the garage at Haley, who was at the desk working, unaware of what he was hearing, her pen moving steadily across her legal pad. "When does Cho want to meet?" Jackson said. "Tomorrow. He'll come to Redwood Falls. He doesn't want her traveling. He wants her in a controlled environment until we understand the full scope of what she's walking into." A pause. "Jackson, this has gotten significantly larger than a domestic abuse and financial fraud case. If Cho's parallel inquiry connects to what Haley has, we may be talking about something that touches organized financial crime at a regional level." Jackson said, "Does Haley know?" "Not the full scope yet. I wanted to talk to you first. She needs to be prepared." "I'll talk to her," Jackson said. He put the phone down. He sat in his office for a moment. Through the window, he could see Haley at the desk, the same desk she'd been working at since the second morning. The desk nobody had asked her to take over, but that had simply become hers, the way certain things become yours when you put enough of yourself into them. He thought about a 15-year-old girl buying a notebook at a drugstore 2 towns over and carrying it home and starting to write things down because she'd already understood, at 15, that the truth needed a witness and she was the only one available. Then he stood up and went to tell her. Haley's reaction to what Jackson told her was not what he expected. She didn't panic. She didn't go pale. She set down her pen and she sat very still for about 10 seconds. And then she said, 3 names. 3 names from your notebook appear in an existing federal investigation." "Which 3? He told her. She was quiet, and then she said, "The logistics company owner was the one I expected. He came to the house too many times for it to be social. The deputy commissioner, I recorded 3 interactions over 2 years. The 3rd name," she paused. "I only have 1 entry for the 3rd name. A partial name, actually. I only heard part of it, and I wasn't certain I had it right. Dale's contact confirmed it. She absorbed that. So I had a piece of a federal case and I didn't know it." "Yes." She looked at her notebook. "For 4 years. Yes." She let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite anything else. Then she said, "Victor knew. He had to know at some level what he was connected to. That's why he was so certain. No one would believe me, not just because of who he was, but because the people around him had as much reason as he did to make sure I was discredited." She looked up at Jackson. "That's why Marsh moved so fast. It's not just Victor protecting Victor. It's a whole network protecting itself." "That's what Ruth thinks," Jackson said. "And Cho." "It also means," Haley said, and her voice had taken on a quality Jackson recognized by now, the quality of someone thinking at full speed, processing and building simultaneously, that the danger level just increased significantly. "Because Victor is not the only one who wants this contained." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said. "Tell me about Agent Cho." Bishop already knew who Raymond Cho was. This surprised no one who knew Bishop, but it still impressed Haley when Bishop came to her that afternoon and told her, in the calm, methodical way he had of delivering information, what he knew about the man they were about to meet. "He's been in financial crimes for 9 years, Bishop said. Before that, he was in organized crime task force work. He has a reputation for building cases slowly and very thoroughly and not moving until he's confident he can close. The fact that he's coming here tomorrow instead of asking you to come to him tells me two things. What two things? Haley said. One, he's serious about this. He wouldn't disrupt his normal process for a minor case. He's coming to you because he doesn't want any record of you traveling to him. He's protecting the integrity of whatever he's building. Bishop paused. Two, he's concerned about your safety, not in a general way, in a specific way, which means he knows or suspects that the network around Caldwell has people with eyes in places that matter. Haley looked at him steadily. He thinks someone might be watching official channels. Bishop confirmed. Like the county sheriff's office, Haley said. Like the county sheriff's office. The implication of that settled into the room quietly. Victor Caldwell hadn't filed the welfare check through the county just because it was convenient. He'd filed it through a channel he had reason to believe he could see into. Which means, Haley said slowly, the welfare check response, the one that said I was found safe and represented by counsel, went back through that same channel. Within hours of Carver filing it, Bishop said. So Victor knows about Ruth. He probably knows Ruth filed documentation last night. He may know about Dale. She stopped. Does he know about Cho? No, Bishop said firmly. Cho is coming through back channels. Nothing official, nothing documented until he decides he wants it documented. That's a standard operating procedure for him when he suspects information leakage in local enforcement. Okay. Haley's voice was steady, but she was working hard to keep it that way. And Bishop could see the effort, which meant Jackson probably could too. And she didn't try to hide it from them anymore. Hiding things from these men felt wrong in a way she was still getting used to. Okay, what do I need to prepare for tomorrow? Tell Cho everything you told Ruth and Dale, Bishop said. Everything you told Jackson. Don't edit for him. Don't decide in advance what's relevant and what isn't. Let him ask the questions and answer them completely. And the part about the night my mother died? Bishop held her gaze. Especially that. The pressure campaign started at 11 that morning. A man named Gerald Marsh called the garage's main line, which Jackson had relocked to members only. But Marsh called Bear's personal cell phone, which meant Victor's people had done enough research to find it. Bear answered. Listened to 30 seconds of professional courtesy wrapped around a thinly veiled offer and said, not interested, and hung up. 20 minutes later, a different number called Bishop's cell. Bishop didn't answer. The voicemail that followed was from someone identifying themselves as a representative of a county development board, inquiring about the lease status of the garage's property, mentioning in a tone of professional concern that there had been some questions raised about the property's zoning compliance. Bishop played the voicemail for Jackson. Jackson called the property owner a man named George Tipton, who had been leasing to the chapter for 8 years before noon. George Tipton told Jackson that he'd received a call that morning from someone asking about the property lease and whether he'd considered selling. He'd said no. The caller had then mentioned, in a tone George described as not exactly threatening, but not exactly not threatening, that it might be worth his while to reconsider. What did you say? Jackson asked. I said the same thing I say every time someone tries to push me on something, George said. I said no, and I hung up. A pause. Jackson, what's going on over there? We're working on something, Jackson said. I'll explain when I can. Can you hold your position? How long have you been renting from me? 8 years. Right. Hold my position. Please, George hung up. Jackson relayed this to the garage. Haley listened and said, he's doing exactly what I predicted. He's pulling threads. He's trying to find the one that unravels something. The lease, Bear's phone, Bishop's number, he's testing the perimeter, looking for the weak point. He's not going to find one, Ricky said with the conviction of someone who believed it completely. He will keep trying, Haley said. Not to contradict Ricky, just because it was true and she needed them all operating on the truth. Victor doesn't stop because a first effort doesn't work. He adjusts and tries the next angle. That's how he's operated for years. She paused. But every time he tries something and it doesn't work, he's also telling us something about what he's worried about. The fact that he went after the lease tells me he's trying to destabilize the physical base of operations. He wants us scrambling over logistics rather than focused on the case. Bishop nodded slowly. So we document every contact, every call, every approach, every single one, Haley said, and we send it to Ruth. Why Ruth? Because a pattern of attempts to coerce, intimidate, and interfere with the people who are legally associated with my case becomes its own evidence. It demonstrates consciousness of guilt. It demonstrates that Victor Caldwell knows what we're building and is trying to stop it, which means he knows it's real and provable. The garage was quiet for a moment, Bear said, with the low, flat certainty that was his version of a declaration. She thinks like a prosecutor. I've had to, Haley said. Agent Raymond Cho arrived the next morning in a car so ordinary it was almost conspicuous in its ordinariness, a gray four-door sedan that had exactly no distinguishing features, driven by a man who looked like he could pass through any room without being remembered. He was 52, Asian American, with close-cropped black hair going silver at the temples and the kind of face that had been trained to reveal exactly as much as it chose to, and nothing more. He introduced himself to Jackson at the door, showed credentials, and said, I'd like a secure space. Minimal people. Just the young woman and her attorney if she's present. Ruth was present. She had driven up from the city at 6 in the morning, and she was sitting at the desk with coffee and her legal pad when Cho came in, and she stood, and they shook hands with the mutual respect of two people who had heard of each other and taken the measure of each other's reputations before this moment. Miss Kavanaugh, Cho said. Agent Cho, Ruth said. Haley is ready when you are. They used Jackson's office. Jackson stayed in the main garage. Bear stayed. Bishop stayed. Ricky stayed. All of them found things to do with their hands, and none of them went anywhere. Inside the office, Cho sat across the small desk from Haley and set a recorder on the surface between them. Do you mind? He said. No, she said. He started the recorder. He gave the date, the time, his name and badge number, and then he looked at Haley and said, I want to start with one question, and I want you to answer it however feels right. Don't edit. Don't decide in advance what's important. Just answer. He paused. Tell me who Victor Caldwell is, not what he does. Who he is. Haley looked at him for a moment, and then she started talking. She talked for 4 hours. Cho interrupted her 47 times she counted. Later, because she was the kind of person who counted things, and every interruption was a specific, targeted question that grabbed a detail she'd mentioned and pulled it into the light to be examined from all angles. He asked about the financial records with the precision of someone who already had adjacent documentation and was testing hers against it, building overlap, looking for the places where her independent evidence confirmed what he had from other directions. When she got to the names from the notebook, the 3 names that had appeared in his existing case file, Cho leaned forward very slightly. Walk me through each one, he said, separately, in sequence. Every interaction you observed or documented. She did. It took 90 minutes. He asked a question after almost every entry. When she was done with the 3rd name, he sat back and was quiet for a moment. The deputy commissioner, he said. The entry from 4 years ago. The conversation you overheard in the study. Yes, you wrote it down that night, within an hour of hearing it. Word for word, as best you could recall. As exactly as I could recall. I repeated it to myself on the way back to my room so I wouldn't lose any of it before I could write it down. Cho picked up the notebook, which Ruth had placed in front of him at the start of the meeting. He turned to the specific page. He read it again. He read it a second time. Then he set the notebook down and looked at Haley, and for the first time since he'd sat down, something in his controlled expression had shifted. It was minimal, barely there, but it was the shift of a man who has just seen a piece he's been looking for fall into place. This conversation, he said carefully, describes what appears to be a payment confirmation between 2 individuals, one of whom held a position of public trust for services that are not identified by name, but are described in terms that suggest they were outside the scope of legitimate activity. Yes, Haley said. You were 15 when you heard this. 15. Almost 16. And you wrote it down. That night, Cho was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Miss Caldwell Haley, I'm going to tell you something that I would not normally tell a witness at this stage of an inquiry. I'm telling you because I believe you've earned it and because I think you need to understand the full scope of what you're sitting inside. He looked at her directly. The network of financial activity we've been investigating for 14 months, the shell companies, the movement of money through intermediary entities, the involvement of several individuals in positions of public and private authority is larger than Victor Caldwell. He is a node in it, an important one, but a node. The inquiry has been moving toward him from one direction for over a year. He paused. Your records move toward him from a completely different direction, and they arrive at the same place. Haley held his gaze without blinking. What does that mean for the case? She said. It means that your independent documentation, compiled by a 15-year-old with no law enforcement training, no legal guidance, and no knowledge of an existing inquiry, corroborates key elements of a federal investigation from an entirely separate evidentiary track. He paused. In evidentiary terms, that is extremely significant, Ruth said. From her chair beside Haley, how significant? Cho looked at Ruth. Significant enough that I need to make a call this afternoon that is going to change the scope of the formal inquiry. The room was very quiet. Haley said, and the night my mother died. Cho turned back to her. He hadn't moved to that yet. He'd been building toward it. She could tell working through the financial records and the network connections first, establishing the evidentiary foundation. And now here they were at the edge of the hardest thing. Tell me, he said. She told him. She told him the same way she'd told Jackson the voices. Her mother's voice sounding wrong. The long silence. Victor's car leaving, going downstairs, finding Diane at the bottom of the staircase. The words she'd heard her stepfather say in the entryway before the fall. She told it without emotion in her voice, because by now she'd told it enough times that she'd found the way to carry it, not suppressing the feeling, but holding it separate from the telling, which was a skill she'd developed over 7 years of carrying things that needed to be carried. When she was done, Cho sat with it for a long time. The official finding was accidental death, he said finally. Yes, that finding was never formally challenged. No, Victor had every resource necessary to ensure it wasn't. But the case was never closed in a way that would prevent it from being reopened. Haley was very still. No, she said slowly. It wasn't. Then the account you've just given me, Cho said, taken in the context of the financial network, the pattern of behavior documented in this notebook over 5 years, and the relationship between Victor Caldwell and several individuals with positions of local authority, the account becomes part of an evidentiary picture that is larger than a domestic abuse case and larger than financial fraud. He paused. It becomes evidence relevant to a federal conspiracy inquiry. Ruth said, very quietly, Raymond. I know, he said. Haley looked at both of them. What does that mean? In practical terms, what does that change? Cho said, it means Victor Caldwell is no longer just looking for a runaway stepdaughter. He is, as of the call I'm going to make this afternoon, the subject of an active federal inquiry. And that changes what his people can and can't do. It changes what protection you're entitled to. And it changes, he stopped, chose the next words carefully. It changes whether the story your mother never got to finish gets told the way it should be told. The silence that followed that sentence was the longest silence in the room since they'd started. Haley's jaw worked once, just once. Then it was still. Make your call, she said. Cho was on the phone for 40 minutes in Jackson's office while Ruth sat with Haley at the desk in the main garage. Not talking, just present. The way Ruth had learned over decades, that presence was sometimes the most important thing you could offer. Jackson stood near the front of the garage. Bear stood near the back. Bishop sat on his workbench. Ricky, who had no talent for stillness, paced a slow circuit between the engine bays. And nobody told him to stop because the movement was useful. It was doing something with the tension that would have otherwise just sat in the room accumulating. When Cho came out of the office, the quality of everything changed immediately. Not because he announced anything, but because of how he carried himself. People who had spent their lives reading situations read it instantly. He looked at Jackson first. Starting today, this location is under federal protective consideration. I can't post agents here without triggering a visible response that I don't want to trigger yet, but I have people in the area who will be aware. He looked at Bear. Any contact from Caldwell's representatives, any calls, any approaches, any pressure on your business relationships, you document it and you send it to me through Ruth. All of it. He looked at Bishop. Your county contact. The one who told you about the welfare check. How solid is that relationship? Solid, Bishop said. I may need information from inside the county office through a back channel. Can that happen? It can, Bishop said. Cho nodded. He turned to Haley. I need originals of the notebook for evidentiary processing. I can give you a full photocopy and a digitized version tonight. I need the original for the chain of custody. Haley looked at the notebook on the desk in front of her. She had carried it for 5 years. She had moved with it through 4 cities and kept it in a waterproof bag inside her backpack and slept with it within arm's reach every night since she was 15. She picked it up, held it for a moment. Then she held it out to Cho. Take care of it, she said. He took it with both hands. I will, he said. And the way he said, it was not a professional assurance, but a human one, which told her something about him that she filed away. One more thing, Cho said to the garage at large. He looked around at all of them. Victor Caldwell is going to find out about this inquiry. Not from me, not from Ruth, not from anyone in this room, but he'll find out. Men like him always do, and usually faster than we'd like. He paused. When he does, the approach will stop being pressure and become something harder. I want everyone in this room clear on that. We're clear, Jackson said. And you're still in, Cho said. Not a question exactly, but close enough. Jackson looked at Bear, at Bishop, at Ricky, at Haley. We're still in, he said. Cho nodded once. Then he looked at Haley one more time. 7 years ago, a girl started writing things down because nobody was going to do it for her. That notebook just became federal evidence. He paused. You did that. She met his eyes. We're not done yet, she said. No, Cho agreed, we're not. Outside, somewhere on Millbrook Road, a car that nobody in the garage could see was parked and watching. It had been there since morning. Victor Caldwell's patience was a real thing, and it was still operating, and he still believed because he had believed it for so long that the belief had become structural, load-bearing that he was the most powerful person in this story. He didn't know yet that the girl he'd spent 7 years underestimating had just handed 7 years of evidence to a federal agent. He didn't know yet that the network he'd built so carefully, contact by contact and payment by payment, had just been seen whole for the first time by people with the authority to act on what they saw. He didn't know yet that the story he'd controlled for so long was no longer his to tell. He was about to find out. Victor Caldwell found out on a Thursday. Not from a leak inside the federal office, not from a contact in the county system, not from Gerald Marsh's surveillance network that had been watching Millbrook Road for weeks. He found out because Raymond Cho wanted him to find out, wanted it in a specific, controlled way at a specific moment when the evidentiary foundation was solid enough that Victor's reaction would become part of the record rather than a threat to it. Cho made a single phone call to Victor's personal attorney at 9 in the morning. He identified himself, stated his office, and informed the attorney that Victor Caldwell was the subject of a formal federal financial crimes inquiry and that certain additional matters pertaining to the death of Diane Caldwell 7 years prior were being reviewed in the context of that inquiry. He gave the attorney exactly 48 hours to advise his client before any formal notification would be served. Then he hung up and called Ruth. It started, he said. Ruth called Jackson. Jackson walked into the main garage and looked at Haley, who was at the desk working, and said, Cho made the call. Haley set her pen down. She sat very still for a moment with both hands flat on the surface of the desk. Then she said, how long before Victor responds? Cho gives it hours, not days. She nodded. She picked up her pen. She went back to work. Bear, watching this from across the garage, said nothing. He turned back to his engine. But his jaw was set in a way that meant he was feeling something significant and had decided that feeling it quietly was the appropriate response. Victor's first response came in 4 hours. It wasn't pressure on the garage lease this time, and it wasn't another welfare check, and it wasn't a smooth-voiced representative calling cell phones with veiled offers. Victor Caldwell, informed by his attorney that the federal government was looking at his finances and at his dead wife's case file, did what powerful men, under genuine threat, almost always do. He overcorrected. He filed a civil lawsuit against Haley. The suit alleged defamation, emotional distress, and interference with business interests. It named her as the source of what it described as a campaign of false allegations designed to damage Victor Caldwell's personal and professional reputation. The filing was elaborate and expensive, and had clearly been prepared well in advance, which told Cho, who Ruth called immediately, everything he needed to know about how long Victor had been anticipating this moment. Ruth called Haley and read her the key claims over the phone. Haley listened to all of it without speaking. When Ruth finished, there was a silence of about 5 seconds. Then Haley said, "He filed this himself, with his name on it. His attorneys filed it on his behalf, but yes, his name is on the complaint as the aggrieved party, which means he's now officially, in a legal document, asserted that my allegations are false." "Yes," Ruth said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "Which means," Haley said, "that if the federal inquiry establishes that my allegations are true, and it will, then this civil filing becomes evidence that he knowingly made false claims to a court." "Haley," Ruth said, "you just described what took me 17 years of practicing law to fully understand about overreach." "He panicked," Haley said. It came out quietly, almost with wonder. "He panicked, and he used his lawyers the way he always uses everything as a first response, because it's always worked before. But this time it's going to work backward." "Yes," Ruth said. "It is." Haley looked across the garage at Jackson. He was watching her, had been watching her since she'd taken the call, reading her face the way he read everything slowly. "Completely," she said. "To Jackson, he sued me." Jackson took that in. "Good," he said. And he meant it, and she knew he meant it. And for a moment, almost like laughter, moved between them. Not because anything was funny, but because, after weeks of waiting for Victor to make the move that would finally expose the full shape of who he was, he had made it. And it was exactly as short-sighted and exactly as arrogant as 7 years of watching him had taught her it would be. Cho's reaction to the civil filing was swift and specific. He called Ruth within the hour and told her that the lawsuit had done something useful. It had given him grounds to formally request Victor Caldwell's financial records through legal channels that were now clearly justified by Victor's own initiation of litigation. A man who sues someone for defamation related to financial allegations opens his own finances to scrutiny. Victor's attorneys had either missed that implication or, which Cho considered possible, had advised him against the filing and been overruled by a client who was more accustomed to his money solving problems than to it creating them. Dale Whitmore had been working through the night on the financial documentation. He called Bishop at 7 in the morning with a voice that was controlled but carrying the particular energy of someone who has been awake for 22 hours staring at numbers that keep confirming something significant. "The East Bridge and Clearwater transfers," Dale said. "I found the terminus." Bishop was very still. "Where?" "A holding entity in a neighboring state. The holding entity has 3 directors. One of them is the logistics company, owner from Fremont. One of them is a name I don't recognize yet." The third, Dale paused. "The third is a man named Harlan Voss." "That name means something," Bishop said. It wasn't a question. Dale wouldn't have paused like that if it didn't. "Harlan Voss sits on the board of 2 regional development authorities," Dale said. "He also served as a senior advisor to 3 consecutive county administrations in Haley's home county. And he has been, for the past 6 years, on the advisory council of the State Infrastructure Commission." Bishop said, "Public money." "That's what I think," Dale said. infrastructure funds moving through a private holding entity. If I'm right, we're not just looking at private financial fraud. We're looking at the diversion of public funds through a network that Victor Caldwell helped operate. Bishop put the phone down and went directly to Jackson's office without knocking. Jackson looked up. "Get Cho," Bishop said. "Right now." The meeting that afternoon had a different quality than any of the previous ones. Cho came back with a second agent, a woman named Sandra Park, who had the same controlled economy of movement as Cho, but a different energy. Sharper edged, the specific sharpness of someone who had spent her career in public corruption cases. She shook hands with Jackson and Bear and Bishop and nodded at Ricky, and she looked at Haley for a moment longer than the others, and then she sat down and said, "I've read the notebook summary. I want to talk about Harlan Voss." Haley looked at her. "I have a partial entry," Haley said. "One interaction. I wasn't sure I had the name right. Walk me through what you observed." Haley did. The visit to Victor's home, the study. The careful way Victor had cleared her from the property before the man arrived. The one partial glimpse she'd had through a window before she'd gone to get groceries, the gray suit, the way Victor had met him at the door rather than having him shown, in which she had noted, because Victor never met anyone at the door, he received people in the study. It was a power positioning thing he did without thinking, and the name, half heard from the entryway, that she'd written down phonetically and never been fully certain of. Sandra Park listened to every word. Then she opened the file she'd brought and slid a photograph across the desk. It was a photograph taken from a distance, slightly grainy, of a man in a gray suit being greeted at a doorway by someone whose profile was visible but partially obscured. "Is this the man you saw?" Sandra said. Haley looked at the photograph for a long time. "Where was this taken?" she said. "Victor Caldwell's home. 14 months ago, as part of routine surveillance, we were conducting for an unrelated inquiry." Sandra paused. "We didn't know who the visitor was at the time. We identified Caldwell, logged the interaction, and filed it. It sat in the case file." Another pause. "Until Dale Whitmore gave us the name Harlan Voss, and Agent Cho pulled the photograph this morning." Haley looked at the photograph again. She looked at the gray suit, the posture, the way the man held himself at the door, the particular stance of someone who was comfortable at this address, who had been here before. "Yes," she said. "That's the man I saw." The room was very quiet. Sandra looked at Cho. Cho said, "The photograph places Harlan Voss at Victor Caldwell's home 14 months ago. Haley's notebook places him there at minimum once, 4 to 5 years ago, in the context of a meeting that Caldwell deliberately obscured from his stepdaughter. Dale's financial analysis places Voss as a director of the Terminus holding entity for funds that originated in Caldwell's shell companies." He paused. "That is 3 independent evidentiary threads pointing at the same individual across a 5-year time frame from 3 completely separate sources." He looked at Haley. "The case you started building when you were 15 years old," he said, "just connected to a public corruption inquiry that my office has been running for over a year." Haley sat with that for a moment. The full weight of it. Not the legal weight, she'd understood the legal significance since Dale had called Bishop that morning. The other weight. The weight of a 15-year-old girl in a drugstore 2 towns over, buying a cheap notebook because she was scared and alone, and the only tool she had was attention and the discipline to use it. The weight of how long she'd carried it. The weight of all the moments she'd doubted herself, all the times Victor's version of reality had pressed so hard against her own that she'd had to grip what she knew with both hands to keep it from slipping. She had not been wrong. She had never been wrong. She had just been alone. "What happens now?" she said. Her voice was steady. It had been steady through all of it, but it cost her something to keep it that way, and for the first time, she didn't try quite so hard to hide that. "We moved," Cho said. "Formal inquiry is already open. The civil lawsuit Victor filed gives us additional grounds for financial disclosure requests. Sandra's public corruption team is coordinating with my financial crimes unit as of this afternoon. We have enough to compel documentation. We have enough to start making things very uncomfortable for everyone in that holding entity." He paused. And we have your account of the night Diane Caldwell died, which is now being reviewed by a division that handles cases where previous findings may have been compromised by the influence of subjects under federal inquiry. The last part landed differently than everything else. Because the last part was about Diane. Bear, who had been standing at the back of the room and had said nothing for the past hour, said quietly, "They're going to look at the accident again." "They are," Cho said. Nobody spoke for a moment. And then Haley said very quietly, "My mother's name was Diane. She was warm and she was funny, and she made everyone around her feel like the world was more manageable than it looked. She spent the last years of her life inside a situation she didn't fully understand and couldn't get out of, and she deserves so much better than what happened to her." She paused. "I want her name in the record. I want it known that she existed and that what happened to her mattered." Cho said, "It will be." She nodded once, and then she straightened in her chair, and something shifted in her posture, not rigidity. Something more like the settling of a person who has put down something very heavy and is adjusting to what their body feels like without it. Victor Caldwell's lawyers called Ruth that evening to discuss the civil lawsuit. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. Ruth, who had spent 3 decades in rooms with powerful men who assumed their resources automatically translated to leverage over her, listened to the opening position and then said with the pleasant precision of someone who had been waiting for this call, I want to make sure your client understands that the filing of this lawsuit has opened his financial records to discovery in a way that will be enormously useful to several ongoing investigations. If he'd like to withdraw, I suggest doing it quickly and quietly." A pause. "If he'd prefer to proceed, we'll see him in court, and so will the federal government." The call ended. The lawsuit was withdrawn before midnight. When Ruth told Haley, Haley was sitting at the desk in the garage, still at the desk, still working. Because working was how she kept her footing, and she had not stopped needing her footing just because things were moving in the right direction. She looked up when Ruth finished. "He withdrew it," she said, "without prejudice, which means he could theoretically refile. But he won't. He's already pivoting to damage control. His people are trying to figure out how contained this can be kept." Ruth paused. "It can't be contained. But he doesn't know that fully yet." "He'll know soon," Haley said. "Yes. And then the real legal maneuvering starts. I want you prepared for that. It's going to be months of process. Haley, possibly longer. Federal cases move at their own pace. There will be motions and delays and moments where it feels like nothing is happening. That's normal. It doesn't mean it's failing." "I know," Haley said. "I've been patient before." "I know you have." Ruth's voice was warm. "I just want to make sure you have realistic expectations about the timeline." "Ruth." Haley's voice was quiet. "I spent 7 years building a case that nobody asked me to build, against a man that everyone around me believed was beyond accountability, with no resources and no support, and no guarantee that anyone would ever take it seriously. I can wait a few more months." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I suppose you can." 3 weeks after Cho's formal inquiry was opened, the first arrest came. It wasn't Victor. Cho had explained, in one of their regular calls, that Victor was the architecture of the network, and that dismantling architecture required taking out supporting structures first. The first arrest was the logistics company owner from Fremont, one of the 3 directors of the holding entity, one of the names in Haley's notebook. He was arrested at his office on a Thursday morning and charged with conspiracy to commit financial fraud and misappropriation of public funds. His arrest was reported locally. A brief item, factual, without much context. Nobody reading it would have understood the full picture yet. But at the garage on Millbrook Road, when Bishop came in with his phone and showed the screen to Jackson, and Jackson showed it to Bear, and Bear walked it over to Haley, she read it in about 30 seconds, and then she set the phone face down on the desk and put both hands flat on the surface and breathed for a moment. Ricky said, from across the garage, "Is it good news?" "It's the beginning of good news," Haley said. She looked up. "There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "Beginning means there's more coming." She picked up her pen, "which means we keep working. But for just a moment, just one brief, private moment that she allowed herself, before the pen touched paper, she closed her eyes and thought about her mother, about Diane, about warmth and funny, and the way she made the world feel more manageable. About a 15-year-old girl who had decided that the truth needed a witness and had decided to be that witness and had not stopped being that witness for 7 years. She thought, Mom, it's starting. Then she opened her eyes and went back to work. The second thing happened 6 weeks later. Harlan Voss resigned from the State Infrastructure Commission on a Monday, citing personal reasons. His resignation was accepted without public comment. The following Thursday, Dale called Jackson with the controlled energy that by now everyone in the garage recognized as Dale's version of excitement. The financial disclosure requests came back, Dale said. Cho's team has been going through them. The diversion of public infrastructure funds through the holding entity, it's bigger than we estimated. The number we're looking at is north of $4 million over 6 years. Jackson repeated this to the garage. Bear said, $4 million. Over 6 years, Jackson said. And Victor was in the middle of it, Bear said. He was the mechanism, Jackson said. According to Dale, the shell companies were the channel. Victor built and maintained the channel. Ricky, who had been following every development with the focused intensity of someone for whom this had become deeply personal, said, so what does that mean for him? For Victor specifically? It means, Bishop said, from his workbench, that when the federal case is fully built, he won't be facing financial fraud charges in isolation. He'll be facing conspiracy to defraud the public, which is a different category of charge with different consequences. Haley, at the desk, heard all of it. She was writing something. She was always writing something, and she finished the line she was on before she set the pen down and said, Cho told me last week that the review of my mother's case file has been formally elevated. They've requested the original medical examiner's report and the police record from 7 years ago. The garage went quiet. He didn't tell the rest of us that, Jackson said. He told me yesterday. He said he wanted me to hear it from him directly before it became more official. She paused. They found something in the original record, a detail in the medical examiner's findings that was noted and then not followed up on. Cho wouldn't tell me exactly what it was. He said it's premature. She held Jackson's gaze. But he said he used these specific words. He said that the finding is inconsistent with the trajectory of an unassisted fall. Nobody moved. Inconsistent with an unassisted fall, Bear said, slowly, like he was turning the words over. Yes, Haley said. The silence that followed was not the silence of shock. Every person in that garage had understood. From the night Haley had told her story, what the truth about Diane probably was. It was the silence of something being confirmed that they had carried as suspicion for weeks, and confirmation, even when you've prepared for it, lands differently than suspicion. It has a different weight, a more final one. Jackson came across the garage and stood in front of the desk. How are you? He said. The question was simple and direct and genuine, which was exactly how Jackson asked things. And Haley looked at him, and for a moment, her face did something she hadn't let it do in front of any of them since she'd arrived. It showed the full cost of what she'd been carrying. Not collapse, not breakdown, but the honest human expression of someone who has been strong for a very long time and is in the presence of people who are strong enough to let her be less than that for a minute. I'm okay, she said. I'm sad. I've been sad for 7 years. She paused. But I'm not afraid anymore. And I haven't been afraid since the night I told you all of it. She looked around at the garage, at Jackson, at Bear, at Bishop, at Ricky, at the space that had become something she hadn't known she needed until she'd found it. That counts for a lot. Victor Caldwell was formally charged 4 months later. The charges came on a Tuesday morning, served at his home in Crestwood by federal agents, and they were extensive. Conspiracy to commit financial fraud, misappropriation of public funds, conspiracy to obstruct justice. And the charge that Cho called Haley to tell her about personally, the night before it was officially filed, 1 count of conspiracy in connection with the death of Diane Caldwell, based on the medical examiner's finding and the pattern of evidence assembled over 7 years by a teenage girl who had refused to let the truth disappear. He called her at 7 in the evening. She was at the desk. She was always at the desk. It's filed, Cho said. She set down her pen. All of it, she said. All of it. She put her hand flat on the desk. Breathed, she said. Haley. Cho paused. What you did, what you built. Starting at 15 years old, in the conditions you were in, without help or guidance or any reason to believe it would ever matter, I have been doing this work for a long time. I have not seen anything like it. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, I had a reason. I had my mother. Yes, Cho said. You did. She thanked him and put the phone down. And then she sat in the garage on Millbrook Road, in Redwood Falls, at the desk that had become hers. And she allowed herself to feel everything, all the grief and the fear and the long years of being alone in it. And underneath all of that, running through it like a current, the thing she had not let herself fully feel until this moment because she hadn't wanted to count on it before she was sure it was real. Relief. The relief of someone who has been holding their breath for 7 years and has finally been allowed to breathe. Jackson came in from the back of the property. He looked at her face. He didn't ask. He just sat down in the chair across the desk the chair had pulled up on the very first night. When she'd been a girl in the rain asking for a job, and he said nothing, and he let her have the moment for what it was. The town of Redwood Falls took time to understand what had happened. The news moved slowly at first, a local item about federal charges against a businessman from a neighboring county, connected to a public funds investigation. The name Victor Caldwell meant little in Redwood Falls. The garage on Millbrook Road meant more. And even then, most people knew it only from a distance. As the Hells Angels place at the end of the road, the one most people drove past without looking. But as the charges became more public and the scope of the network became clearer, as names attached to local development projects and county offices began appearing in reporting that grew more detailed and more serious with. Each week, Redwood Falls started paying attention. And as it paid attention, it began to understand that the young woman at the center of it had been sitting in a garage on Millbrook Road for months, working at a desk, building something alongside a group of men that most people in town had spent years carefully not looking at. That recalibration happened slowly. It happened in the way small communities recalibrate through conversation, through the gradual revision of assumptions, through the accumulation of small moments that add up to a different understanding of something you thought you already knew. The men who had seemed intimidating became, in the retelling, the people who had given a girl with nowhere to go a place to stand. The garage that had seemed like a place to avoid became the place where something important had been protected long enough to matter. And the young woman who had walked in out of the rain asking for honest work became the person who had walked out the other side of the hardest 7 years of her life with the truth intact. Bear found her one morning, 6 months after Cho's call, sitting at the desk with the notebook, the copy, not the original, which was in federal evidence open in front of her. She wasn't writing in it. She was just looking at the pages. He sat down across from her. You should write a new one, he said. She looked up. What? Start a new notebook, Bear said. Not for evidence, not for protection. He paused, searching for the word, just for the record, of what's happening now, of what comes next. She looked at him for a long moment. You think there's something worth writing down? She said. I think there's a hell of a lot worth writing down, Bear said. And I think you're the right person to write it. She looked back at the old notebook. Then she looked up at the garage around her, at Bear across the desk, at Bishop at his workbench, at Ricky, who had come in early again because he always came in early now, at Jackson's office window, where Jackson was on the phone, his forearms on his desk, his face carrying the expression of a man managing the 10,000 ongoing things that the chapter required, the same expression he'd been wearing when she'd first seen him put down his wrench and walk toward a girl in the rain. She thought about her mother, about what Diane had never gotten to write, about what Diane had never been given the time or the safety to say out loud. She reached into the drawer. She took out a new notebook, plain small, exactly like the first one. She wrote the date on the inside cover. Then she opened to the first page. She picked up her pen, and she began. There are stories that end with justice, and there are stories that end with peace. And there are stories that end with both rare, difficult, hard-won, the kind that cost everything they cost and still somehow come out the other side worth it. Haley Caldwell's story was not finished. Federal cases don't end quickly, and grief doesn't end at all, and there would be courtrooms ahead, and difficult days, and moments when the weight of all of it would press down harder than she expected. But the woman sitting at that desk, pen in hand, new notebook open, was not the girl who had stood in the rain, asking permission to exist in a space where someone might finally see her clearly. She was someone who had walked into a dark place and stayed long enough to make it bright. She had come to Redwood Falls with nothing but a torn backpack and 5 years of truth, and she had found, in the last place the world would have expected, people who understood that truth, real truth, documented and defended and held against every force that tried to erase it, was worth everything it cost to protect. She wrote the date. She wrote the first line. And outside on Millbrook Road, in the town that had learned to see her, the world went on changed in the way that all things change when the right story finally gets told, quietly and completely, and without anyone being able to take it back.